Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and I've been thinking that Rodgers and Hammerstein's Carousel might be a lot more exciting, in fact perhaps physically so, if it were to drop the C. And that's a joke that probably works a great deal better on paper. So we'll file it and move straight on to the order of the day. Now, today we're going to be looking at two very different musicals about the same thing. And the thing is Troy. Now, the story of Troy, of course, is a legend in its own right. There is some historical fact in it, but it has been elaborated over the years. And the thing that sticks out the most will be Helen of Troy and the wooden horse of Troy, no relation. And both have been explored in the world of musical theatre, and more than once at that. Today we're going to be talking about two different examples. The first is a musical which you could have seen at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2015, and which you can still see because a version of it has been placed on YouTube, called Horseplay. Now that was a musical by Ross MacFarlane and was presented by the Napier University Drama Society. And as I say, if you want to go and see it, go to YouTube and type in Horseplay, the Troy musical. It was a show that I watched with Michael Gordon-Shapiro, and I should clarify it was the recorded version that we watched, and which we then recorded a conversation about. So in just a minute you'll hear that conversation with Mike and myself about Horseplay, the Troy musical. And then later in the episode, I thought, as we're talking about Troy and large horses and Helen, the face that launched 1,000 ships, it might be a good idea to revisit a conversation I had a few years ago with the wonderful Kit Hesketh-Harvey, a writer, a performer, a man of letters, and a great entertainer all round, who had written a new English translation of Offenbach's La Belle, Helene a few years ago, and called it, wittily in my view, Troy Boy. So that's what's on the menu today. To recap, in the second half of the episode, it's me talking to Kit Hesketh-Harvey about Troy Boy, his new English translation of La Belle Helene by Offenbach, telling the story of Helen of Troy, and which was recorded a few years ago. But before that, in just a minute, it's Michael Gordon-Shapiro talking to me about Horseplay, the Troy musical. And if there's ever a single song that sums both of these musicals up, it must be the Big Horse song. What do you mean you don't know the Big Horse song? Let me sing it to you. Maybe it's a big horse, I'm a Londoner. Okie dokie, moving on. Let's listen to those interviews. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Which brings us no further on in my social life, but takes us to the next show in a completely non sequitur kind of a way, which is Horseplay, which is the Troy musical by Ross MacFarlane, put on by the Napier University, and is obviously a telling of the story and legends of Troy. A well-trodden path in musical theatre terms. I'm sure we've heard of Jacques Offenbach and the Belle Helene, and the various translations of that over the years, including Troy Boy by Kit Hesketh-Harvey, who I interviewed about his English translation of Offenbach's musical a few years ago. Technically an opera bouffe, I think, certainly an opera comique. This is doing something very different with the Troy legends. And I think you were rather taken by it, weren't you, Mike? Which means I'm handing over the description to you now.
This is a whimsical and very witty retelling of the Troy legend that is perhaps comparable to A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, in that it's a irreverent revisitation of these characters and reconceiving them as being very, I don't want to say frivolous, but definitely light on their feet. There's the story is narrated by Homer, who helps accelerate things by giving us exposition. And even though we know the legend, we know the grim conclusion, it manages to be entertaining and fun throughout its duration, while at the same time bringing, I think, a real wit. I think there's a real cleverness, as well as a functional approach to music. I think the mood is extremely well established at the outset when we are told that the subtitle of the show is, "If at first you don't succeed, Troy, Troy again."
Boom, boom.
I think that sets our expectations. And the humor is irreverent and a little bit silly, and there are comparisons to present-day culture. There are characters that feel like they were taken out of vaudeville in order to deliver some jokes. Can I remember? I think one of them, you have two kind of wisecracking guys come during the opening number, and one says, "I found some torn pants of a famous Greek playwright, Euripides. No, they were torn when I found them."
I thank you.
So there's that kind of wisecracking humor throughout. But that said, I feel like the songs in this show were actual storytelling songs. And I think this is an accomplishment that's worth drawing us some attention to. They weren't necessarily the most complicated songs. There was a lot of kind of oompa boom chick stuff that, again, feels very vaudevillian and reminiscent of Forum. But they always had a lyrical focus. The lyrics are always well integrated into the story and the music itself. I wrote down a few. The opening number is a recounting of the influence of Greek culture to subsequent generations and subsequent cultures. And the refrain is, "It's all Greek to me," which is kind of like a perfect generalization to have in your opening number.
It's a list song. It's a witty list song, amongst other things, isn't it?
It does. It establishes the milieu of the story without trying to comment too heavily on the events that happen subsequently. So again, there's a definite parallel to Forum in that respect, that famously had to comment on the setting and the mood of the setting as a show-saving maneuver done after a disastrous preview.
That will be Comedy Tonight, which sets up its vaudeville roots and eases you into the tone, yes.
Exactly. It couldn't. That is the most maximally clear song in musical theater history. The song where Troy is talking to Helen, or perhaps it's the other way around, trying to persuade the other to escape Sparta and run off, and thus triggering the sequence of events that would really give rise to the legend of the Trojan horse. I think the refrain or the title of the song is "We Could Leave Tonight," which is succinct and clear and immediately conveys the meaning. When the king, first among equals of Sparta, discovers the treachery, his song is "This Means War." Again, they're drawing from catchphrases in common parlance, but giving them meaning in the story, which I think is very clever.
There's another example of that coming up in a minute, isn't there?
There may be several, but the last one that I wrote was at the end of the show, where the lament is, I think it's "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," which is, forget the name of the character who's warning the citizens of Troy.
Cassandra,
thank you. I was going to say Pandora, but that wouldn't make sense.
I'll box your ears.
Cassandra is trying to, she's warning the citizenry of Troy, who are motivated by a mixture, I think, of religious reverence, and obviously through the enactment of this moment, it's clear there's just a bunch of Simpsons-like greed of the mob that are just overjoyed that they've gotten this free horse, and that in itself is a very funny moment, and that's counterpointed by Cassandra's song of "Beware Greeks bearing gift." So I was really impressed by the lyrics in that they were often very functional, and they did draw from known expressions, but they did so in a way that gave meaning to the scenes in which they took place. And it's nice to see, in the context of a comedy, functional music that is directly tied to the story and often advances the story itself. So that was a real accomplishment, along with the wit and the tongue-in-cheek humor of the piece.
You've drawn out several points there, I think, quite interestingly. You're right, dramatic purpose, but also badged, if you like, with well-known sayings and phrases. Actually, funny enough, the song I was thinking of when it came to a well-known saying or phrase was the clever inversion of the idea of... The Greeks had the idea of creating their horse to give to the Trojans, which, of course, is full of Greek soldiers who's going to slaughter them. And they realise that it's going to destroy, if their plan is successful, it will destroy the kingdom of Troy. And the song is called A Kingdom for a Horse. And of course, obviously that's from Shakespeare's Richard III, but is known only in that context. To be able to take that well-known phrase, repurpose it, is clever in itself, I think.
I agree. And that kind of wit and cleverness is just throughout the show, even when it's being silly. And I want to stress that it's not aloof humor. It's not humor that's reveling in its own wit. But there are plenty of moments that are just plain fun. One of my favorites, which might have been a cast improvisation, I don't know, but just kind of this dramatic moment, the citizenry, the truce has just been broken because of the thwarting of the duel between Paris and the head of the Spartans, and they've decided, let loose the dogs of war. And just as the lights are going out, someone shouts, "Why is all of this in English?" Which is just this throwaway moment, but it's really fun. And then when the Trojans are looking at this seeming gift, the king of Troy says, "Yes, tell the troops to bring it in." That's not totally a terrible idea.
I think he actually says it slightly differently. I actually wrote it down because it did make me laugh. It's, "Bring in the horse. That's totally not a bad idea." Or is it...
Thank you. Your formulation is much more accurate and also much funnier. So there's
well, in fairness, I took it from what they said. So.
It's a wink to the audience, and in the context of a story where we know how it ends, it's particularly funny.
Yes. So you're impressed by the score in from a dramaturg kind of point of view, actually, I think would be the way to look at it, isn't it? Certainly a dramatist, anyway, at least. It serves the narrative first, and then anything else it is able to offer, which of course it does, and in spades, is very much added value.
I agree, and I think this is the real challenge. This is exactly what we were talking about earlier with some of the other shows, is the real challenge of musical comedy is to keep the songs purposeful while keeping them entertaining. And you can always add a digression. You can always add a silly number that has nothing to do with anything, but is a toe tapper or is just whimsical and fun. But I am especially impressed when a musical comedy can entertain us while still advancing the story. And I think that's a real accomplishment here.
Now, I'm going to do something which I almost never do when talking about a score, and that's actually talk about the band in this case, because I really liked the choice of instruments to the point where actually I noticed them, which is something I rarely do. I'm much more of my ear is more attuned to lyric than it is to the musical bed on which it sits. I appreciate they are partners, and I believe equal partners, but it's rare for me to be transported by the music. And it was a mixture for the most part of piano, guitar, and clarinet. Just occasionally there was a snare drum for any martial piece. But it was essentially guitar, piano, and clarinet. And I find, and this is probably just me, but I find the sound of a lone clarinet or oboe or something of that nature against a piano background to be a very appealing sound. I've always found it more pleasing to my soul, shall we say, than almost any other combination. I also think of it very strangely as, and this is an odd thing to say, it's very English, and that's a very terrible thing to say. English, not British. I usually go for British, but it seems to me a very English sound. I don't know if it's Vaughan Williams coming through or something like that, but to me it sounds like that. Now, bearing in mind this is the Napier University, which is Edinburgh, and many of the cast were clearly Scots, and it's written by a gentleman by the name of Ross MacFarlane. I don't know him, but I would guess Scots from that name. But the musical sounded English rather than Scottish or British, and that I could be wrong in the way I'm classifying that, and you're probably now going to tell me that clarinet and piano is widely adopted across the world, and I'm sure it is. But I really liked the sound, which is not to say the melody. I thought the melodies were all fine, but it was the sound that was coming through really took me somewhere.
Well, it's worth remembering that piano, which often has the burden of a lot of the musical duties of a musical, particularly when it's a lower budget show. And practically speaking, piano is the main instrument that you need because it can play chords and do any kind of harmony. But it is a percussion instrument. And there is something a little bit fatiguing about all piano all the time. A wind instrument is intrinsically legato, even though they can play a variety of articulations. And it adds a really nice contrast because you have something very flowing and sustained and lyrical. You can't really sustain a note on a piano. You can hold the sustain pedal and listen to it die out more slowly, but it's still a percussion instrument. So yes, it's a very nice tonal contrast when you have the two working together. And clarinet also has a heritage of association with comedy through jazz and New Orleans, and it can do a variety of effects that we perceive as comedic, like pitch bends. You think of the opening of Rhapsody in Blue.
Oh, yes.
And it also has it has a wide register. It can play low and it can play high. And it has a wide dynamic range, which is not true of all the woodwinds. So it's extremely versatile and practical choice if you're going to have a wind instrument supplementing your piano. And I think what you're responding to was just the breath of fresh air that a sustained instrument can give us when we're so used to hearing a percussion instrument.
That is marvellous to hear, because I wasn't able to articulate that. I hadn't even been able to work out what it was that was drawing me in. But that makes a huge amount of sense. In my head, the way I'm sort of translating that into my layman's talk is that you can certainly make sound from the rocks at the bottom of a riverbed, but it's a damn sight better if you can also hear the sound of the water trickling over them. And that's sort of the difference between the percussive instrument and the wind instrument in this case. Thank you. Thank you for helping illuminate my thinking and understanding, actually, on that, Mike. That's given me lovely food for thought. I'd like to just mention a kind of sketch element to it. And I didn't think on the whole it was a series of sketches. There were a series of scenes, but there was one scene which was definitely a sketch. And it sort of stood alone, actually. I enjoyed it a great deal. It's fairly early on. As people may or may not know within the Troy story, Paris, who's a prince of Troy, it turns out, although he doesn't know it when he's young, and he's been raised as a shepherd, is given a golden apple, which is inscribed for the fairest. And he then has to work out which of the three gods he's going to give it to. So basically he has to flatter one god and offend two. And he's offered Hera, Athena and Aphrodite. And the way they do this scene in Horseplay is to do it as an episode of Blind Date. I don't know if it's a program that made it in America, but it's where young singletons, male or female, meet behind a screen so they can quiz them with questions, three potential suitors of the opposite gender. Is that a program that made it to America?
It may well have. I recognized it generally as being a reality show format and a kind of allusion to that tradition.
In this country, it was hosted for many years by one of the people who's been identified as one of the great British treasures, Cilla Black, who's no longer with us. But it went on for years and therefore was a proper television institution in this country, whether you watched it or not. But it was very witty, I thought, to have a choice of three women by a man and put it in a context that everyone understands, which immediately gives it great comedy chops, and then play it fairly straight. And they added a song to it. So there was Hera is all about power. So she sings a lyric along the lines of, "Those underlings will cower when you reign with total power, if you just pick me tonight." And then Athena says, "Your enemies so vicious, well, they'll be sleeping with the fishes if you just pick me tonight." And then for some reason, the third verse is differentiated by Aphrodite, who's the ultimate winner, and it's more about attractiveness rather than power or success in war. She sings the third verse of the same song, but with a much more kind of Blueberry Hill slow rock and roll rhythm, which gives it a kind of much more powerful allure in the sense of sexually, at least, or at least within the context of the piece. But I really like the idea of the choice of three women being turned into Blind Date, which is that format. It's just very good. And then we didn't see that much more of that kind of clever parallel elsewhere, which is not to say the piece wasn't clever, but that was an overt sketch in an otherwise relatively... This is where I think you and I might differ, actually, Mike, slightly. It seemed to me that whenever Homer was around as the narrator or being the Cilla Black sort of host character on Blind Date, there was lots of comedy, and that was he was not only info dumping, he was adding a lot of comedy and making comment. But quite often the scenes then played out relatively straight, and I actually found that tone a little bit odd, which is not to say it wasn't successful. But I thought we were being given, if you like, a sort of comic framework in which a straight story was being told. But I'm wondering if I've been oversensitive to that, because maybe I wanted it to be more of a laugh riot all the way through. And in fact, actually, it did allow itself time to tell the story with the tragic nature of that story being in the forefront, because it is a terribly sad story.
I think the show made the choice to recount... to structure itself based on the traditional narrative of the story of the Trojan horse. So other than the one moment you mentioned, it didn't drastically depart from the series of events. Now, obviously, they were hyper-stylized in a way that was pure comedy. But the succession of events, if you just were to break it down in plot-wise, would have been constrained by the historical accounts. And perhaps what you are yearning for is more historical liberties to maybe present something that's more akin to Forum, where, it's not hyper specific to a particular tale and thus can go its own way.
Yes, you're right. This is a foreign policy story, whereas Forum is a domestic story. It's a home front story, if you like. Yes,
or a foreign policy.
Hey, for the prize for this afternoon now goes to you, Mike.
Oh no, at best I'm 1 to your 4 at this point. But so yeah, I do think that's the limitation of the story, or rather, the limitation in the musical is that it is following the story, and the story is. It's what I call in a musical when you're watching stuff happen to people rather than when you're not necessarily sympathizing with a particular person and experiencing the world with them and through their eyes. So even though Paris is the hero, or maybe he's the villain, I guess it depends on your perspective.
He's the principal protagonist, I would argue, because, yes, he's not played very charmingly. As he would be in La Belle Helene, funnily enough. You find a lot more sympathy for him in that, I think.
And I think it is possible to tell that story and make us utterly sympathetic to his point of view.
Yes.
But as this is a 1 hour light comedy, you can't really get into his head and explore the issue of following the dictates of your heart and chancing the consequences, and in this case, the consequences being dire. So we are watching it as outsiders, and we are entertained, but there isn't quite that resonance we would get if we had a true sympathetic character. The focal point of the story has to shift in order to tell the narrative. So it's not even the adventures of Paris. It's really looking at the narrative as the focal point of the story. So if I were to try to paraphrase your opinion back to you, maybe you are missing that quality which musicals can have when they choose to stick with the point of view of a protagonist and truly make us sympathize.
Yeah, that's very fair. And even, I suppose I agree with what you've said there, and I think you've helped me see that actually I'm so used to Helen and Paris being the main people in this story. And, for example, Menelaus being shown off as terribly weak and feeble and not deserving of a wonderful wife like Helen in the more traditional tellings. And once again, I am going straight back to the Offenbach here. But actually, Menelaus is a proper warrior king in this. He's a bit of a bore, as it happens. He's a terrible man, but he's a soldier first, and there's no doubting he's a soldier, and a fairly cruel man. So he's not weak and ineffectual in any way. And therefore, Paris seems more selfish, more treacherous. Helen does not seem to have the many virtues of which she is so often attributed. I'm not casting a judgment on the looks of the actress, anything but that. I'm actually talking about the fact that Helen is supposed to be this appealing character in all her virtues. And of course, she isn't in this particularly. So there is no sympathetic character. You're absolutely right. But it's not just for lack of a sympathetic character. It's an ensemble piece. And ensemble pieces can work really well in musical theatre, but they are harder because we are naturally, I think, driven as an audience to link and connect and engage with one or two characters. And there isn't anyone here. There's no one you really lament the death of, actually, at the end, with the possible exception of Cassandra. Partly because hers is so madly arbitrary.
Right, you're looking at a funny retelling. It's about characterization and style rather than theme and plot.
Yes.
Because the plot is well known, and there isn't really a moral to it, right? Like there's no coherent moral because the foolishness of the Trojans in taking the obvious trap is not something that's really set up earlier in the story. It's not like the entire story is about vanity overriding caution. Because if you think of the instigation of the whole problem, Paris is legitimately enraptured by Helen. So his action there is not the same kind of vapid distraction that the citizens of Troy are portrayed as having. So there isn't really a message to the whole thing. And indeed, like Greek myths don't often have a take-home message other than try not to be at cross purposes with the gods, if at all possible.
Yes. So don't upset your betters.
So where we have a well-known plot and no real coherent theme, we're left with the style, which I think is the real joy of the show, that it's just so witty and fun throughout. And it approaches dark subjects with a light touch that I found personally appealing. And this is obviously my subjective ranking of elements of the show according to my preferences, but that was my takeaway.
No, I'm absolutely happy with that. And I think it's quite right that we should draw different things from it slightly. Don't get me wrong, I thought it was fantastic, but I don't think I got quite the joy from it that you did. But that's merely tonal differences. I think we've established that my brow is very much closer to the floor than yours, I think. So, as I say, if only they had made one of the kings, or maybe perhaps one of the queens, a man dressed as a woman, I might have been more in, shall we say. Yes, if Helen had been a man in drag. You see, I can now start writing this version in my head. It's already entertaining me, you see. So
right.
I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed, Mike, and I look forward to talking to you again, perhaps about more online musicals until the real thing comes along. But that sounds like a different song.
Indeed. Well, I look forward to that. And until then, I will say farewell.
Musical Talk. Kit, it's lovely to see you again, if I may say.
Thank you. It's lovely to be seen.
Troy Boy, La Belle Helene, operetta, an unusual move for you? Or not an unusual move, because you have a huge raft of experience in this field under your belt.
Under my belt,
but perhaps don't know it.
As principally as an adapter and a translator, this is the first time since university, really, I've ventured into being on that side of the stage. Obviously, I've been directed myself many a time and oft in Kit and the Widow, and in stage shows we've done like Tomfoolery with Dilly Keane and Salad Days, which we did in the West End under the guidance of Nid Sherin, may he rest in peace. But this is the first time, as I say, since Cambridge that I've actually been at the helm, which is faintly sickening, but I'm having huge fun, and they're a wonderful, wonderful young company, all fresh and open to ideas and full of ideas. And they're contributing just as much as I am, which is terrific.
So let's go back to the text.
Mm-hmm.
It's Offenbach's 1864 operetta La Belle Helene,
something
which is
like
Helen
that.
of Troy, basically.
Helen of Troy, but it's his complete piss take. Can I say piss take on a podcast of
as often as you can.
Of Greek history? In as much as it's very much a sort of Asterix version, Frankie Howard version of Sparta and Troy, and it's done with a very heavy nod and a wink to the contemporary state of France at the time, and the Troisième Empire, and the sense of decadence that was beginning to prevail. So and it's about the sex war. It's about men subjugating women, women being treated as trophies, which Helen ultimately was, and about the world of Zeus, the masculine martial world of Zeus, where we start, to the world of Aphrodite, the world of sensual free love. And it's basically a Shirley Valentine story, that a woman is trapped in a dreary marriage. She finds a beautiful Greek boy, and will she see it through? And what will be the consequences? In Shirley Valentine, she goes back to Liverpool, and it's all buried again. In Helen's case, she starts the Trojan War and launches the 1,000 ships. But we've also rediscovered, unlike the Eno production, we've included another aria for Helen in Act 3, which kind of flings down the gauntlet to men in an almost feminist way. It's sort of saying the gods were invented by men, destiny, which she's always feeling a victim of throughout the piece, is an invention of men. Why should she, Helen, capitulate and buckle down to all these artificial mores imposed on her if she's married to a dreary man for political reasons, and if she's fallen in love with a beautiful boy, then she should be allowed to go off with a beautiful boy. So at the end, she actually rejects the whole paraphernalia of Greek mythology and makes her decision.
Splendid. How did you come across this extra song? As you
I didn't. Our lovely director, Stephen Hose, musical director, found it and said, How about this? At the Eno, we had 2 intervals. Here we're doing it with 1, which means that Act 1 is an hour and a quarter, and Act 2 was about 25 minutes. So we had to find something to make Act 3 more substantial, and I hope that this will do it. She steps completely out of character, out of time, and just sings on behalf of women everywhere, which is an apt role, I think, for somebody of that sort of iconic status of Helene of Troy, who's always just been perceived as a dumb blonde, and a sort of a hapless victim. But here we have her actually make her decision, which is not what Pauline Collins made.
But it's very much more like Jane Mansfield, bizarrely, who was always perceived as a dumb blonde, but could speak, I think, 9 different languages.
Oh yes, bright as a button, wasn't she? Yeah, yes. And Uma Thurman.
Yes, of our current ilk.
Of our current epoch. Yeah.
So how did you, if you don't mind me asking, you first translated this in 2006. How did you connect with Offenbach in the first instance?
I'd done...
Apart from the usual dating sites.
I'd done an awful lot, actually, of translations of 19th century operetta for various companies, for Grange Park, for English touring opera, for Scottish opera, and indeed at the moment I've got The Merry Widow going around with Opera North in Giles Havergal's wonderful production. And it wasn't a field I felt completely unfamiliar with. What happened with La Belle Helene was that it was the Châtelet production from France, directed beautifully by Laurent Pays, and we had Felicity Lott and Toby Spence, Rolls-Royce cast, as Helene and as Paris. The French production was brought over wholesale to the Eno, complete with production team. Who then discovered that it being the Eno, they had to do it in English. I think there was a certain amount of tension in that decision. And because the Colosseum is such a vast space, and because we had such enormous resources, it became a very different show to what I think this will be, which is much trimmer and slicker and younger. We don't have a chorus, we have a band of 6, orchestra of 6. It's going, I hope, to be much more like a sort of café-concert in Paris, where the fourth wall completely disappears, or in the Eno's case, the vast proscenium arch and the yawning orchestral pit in front of it. And here there's a lot of interaction with the audience. We get the audience up on stage at various points. There is lap dancing. It's the whole thing. It's like a sort of naughty night out in Belle Epoque Paris.
And that's very much the ethos of the Merry Opera Company, isn't it? With which you're working on this piece. Am I right in thinking they're trying to introduce what people might see as opera and operetta to a new traditional music-going, even pantomime audience?
I think so. I think it's... I've aimed this squarely at the woman who actually buys the tickets, who is a nice woman from Chislehurst in her late 30s, who's trying to prop up her marriage. So she's very much our sort of link with our audience.
And if you are that person, listeners, please do buy those tickets now.
So the other thing about Merry Opera, who were hitherto called unexpected opera, is they do it in less expected venues. I mean, some of our places, like the Norwich Playhouse or the Chipping Norton Theatre, are standard theatres. But we open in a Wetherspoons in Tunbridge Wells, and we then decamp for a longish run at the Gatehouse in Highgate, in a room upstairs from a pub. I mean, it's a distinguished fringe venue, but it is basically a room above a pub, and the dressing room doubles up as the audience crush bar, so you're very likely to bump into a half-naked Greek slave as you sip your gin and dubonnet, or ouzo, I hope, in this case.
There are several pubs in London where you can do that anyway.
Well, I think
but
so.
Here you get a show as well.
Here you get the show as well, yes, exactly.
Now, can I ask you a few questions about your approach to translation, if you don't mind me saying? Because we've had a conversation before where you said the 3 records you had as a child were Gilbert, Flanders, and Coward, I think.
Coward. There wasn't a Gilbert, actually. It was Julian Slade. It was Salad Days. But
Shift gears by 100 years.
Exactly, shift gears by 100. And there's a very wonderful production of Salad Days going on at the moment at the Riverside, which I must try and see. But
so that's very much in the British school.
It is, and it's
but
something...
But you also have Sondheim connections. So when you sit down with a foreign text...
well, I have, Stephen on my shoulder, saying the first thing to establish is tone, is the hardest thing to do. Second, intelligibility. And although Sondheim is known for his rhymes and celebrated for his rhymes come a very long way down the list. I think what you have to do is be true to the character. You have to make it absolutely intelligible on first hearing to an audience. But in music, if you're translating comedy lyrics, which is what I principally do, from whatever language, I've even done Czech for Covent Garden, which I don't speak a word of,
A free translation.
A free translation. Well, I had the great Charles Macaras on my shoulder then, who does speak Czech and is very exacting. Bless him.
You have the most marvellous shoulders. If
I
say.
have got some very distinguished parrots on my shoulder. It's a question of making the gag, if there is a gag, land with the musical phrase and the rhyme all at the same time, and that's when you score exponentially far more than you should for what is probably a fairly weak joke. But sometimes there's remained true to character, and in this case there is a what makes it not English and Gilbert and Sullivan is Act 2, that there's a fantastically sensual Act 2 in the bedroom when she very, very nearly she gets into bed with Paris, and they very nearly do the dirty deed when she's interrupted. And that's a long, extended thing which makes us really... Sorry,
Splendid
that's terrible.
choice of words.
And believe me, I think we're going to see it. No, I've completely lost my thread. It's a very long, beautiful, wonderfully written in that sort of barcarolle reverie that Offenbach is so good at. Sort of sensual, romantic dream, which hopefully makes us absolutely care about Helen and realise that here is a sensual woman just waiting to be awakened, and about the sensual power of Aphrodite. And it's more intimate, it's more real, it's more truthful than anything in Gilbert and Sullivan, and it's not done with a nod and a wink.
Well, in a way, I think you must have hit the nail on the head there, because Gilbert and Sullivan are splendid in my book, absolutely. But one of the things I very much enjoy about them is the fact that they don't shilly-shally around with all the wet stuff.
All the wet stuff. Well, no, there's yards of the wet stuff in here. And the French do it consummately well. I mean, not just Offenbach, but Meyerbeer and Debussy and all those guys knew how to express the power of love in a way that's become sort of what is the word? Brain going. End of the day. In a way that we absolutely associate with the French.
Oh, right.
That the French can sing about love. Edith Piaf can sing about love far better than any Englishman or Englishwoman.
To be able to balance the two, and in fact to combine them, to make them integrated, is in fact actually a great skill, which is not a British skill, I think, in terms of...
I think you're absolutely right.
A great deal of theatre and musical theatre.
I mean, one has to watch out, because as soon as you do anything that's late 19th century and light-hearted in English, it will sound like Gilbert and Sullivan. Yes. And we have to try and move that away with costume, with lighting, with acting, and with finding in our extremely decorative and wonderfully sung Paris and Helen a romantic truth in that.
So how do you, forgive me saying, how do you keep yourself away from falling into the traps of Gilbert? Or anyone else, but I use Gilbert as the obvious.
Yeah, no, obviously, and Gilbert was an enormous master, and I absolutely respect him. I think
did translate Offenbach on one occasion.
Did he?
He did The Brigand. It's the only Gilbert and Offenbach.
My lord, I must look at that. Well, it was an original libretto he did with collaborator.
Oh, no.
He translated
an original. It was the
Gilbertian
translation.
I see.
I think in the 1890s, after his trouble with Sullivan.
After he had a bit of his run-in with his collaborator. I think you have to avoid Latinate words. You have to resist jokes. You have to avoid intrusive rhymes. And that, again, was a lesson that Sondheim taught me. If it's not appropriate... that she make a clever rhyme at this point, then you don't do it. And Sondheim...
If she won't, you don't.
If she won't, I don't, exactly. And Sondheim is always famously castigating himself for I Feel Pretty. That's his big set example, that as a young man, he made Maria sing stuff that a simple Puerto Rican girl never would, and rhymes too clever. She
was pretty and witty and gay.
And yes, and a committee and, all that stuff, which is inappropriate. And that's what he meant, I think, by tone and truth to the character and truth to the dramatic mood. I mean, having said that, the the palace surroundings in the world of Sparta is absolutely royally sent up, and also presupposes, which is tricky for a 21st century audience, a knowledge of the Greek myths, which isn't instantly familiar, but would have been to the 19th century educated audience. So they know that there are two in the Iliad. The French would have known that there were two Ajaxes, two kings Ajax, which is a huge, great joke in this piece. And we've just had to skirt round by having one as a puppet mini-me on the other guy's arm, who's just slightly demented and always carries this little reassuring puppet of himself everywhere he goes to bolster his confidence.
He's a puppet government.
But having said that, the Mayak and the Ivy original libretto is full of silly gags of the Asterix, the Gaul kind of nature, about ancient Greek history. So we are slightly in Blackadder land as well.
Now, can I ask, do you have free... I mean, you've already explained that this is a reworking of the story in its widest sense, i.e. it's set now in Britain.
Yes.
How free did you feel you could be when translating it? So it seems an obvious question, because I'm sure you're going to tell me fairly free, but in order to keep the spirit of the thing.
Fairly free, but in order to keep the spirit of the thing.
Beautifully put, if I might say. But how much license do you feel that you can give yourself before you're actually moving away from your text, I suppose, is the question I'm very stumbling towards.
I think, again, it's a question of the mood. If you're in Act 1 and you're in this idiotic world of buffoon kings and buffoon Greek heroes showing off, then you can bring in all the anachronisms and all the jokes and all the gags about X Factor that you like. If you are in a different mood, if you're in Act 2, then you have to rein in on all that and make it the sort of stuff that they would have sung in ancient Greece as much as in 21st century Chislehurst. I don't know why I've got it in for Chislehurst. It's a very nice place. But it just seemed that Chislehurst is our sort of imaginary locus. But we do, no, we even when we move into ancient Greece, we've got loads of blackberries going on and gags of that nature. I mean, hopefully they're all frivolous and light-hearted, and they're not sort of concept, and we don't have Verdi on the lavatory or anything like that. But that was absolutely the spirit of the original piece. So why not just, do it for our own time?
Well, here we are 5 years later from your 2006 original translation. Mm-hmm. How did you get the opportunity of directing it? And did you say yes, absolutely, or did you say ooh?
I went ooh, not sure, because as I say, I haven't directed for yonks. And no, the company came to me. They initially said, "Can we use your translation?" And I said, and they said, "And would you like to direct it?" And the thing about a young company of unknowns is that you have very much more freedom of casting. You can actually go for what you want. You're not saying, look, here is an internationally paid diva that we have contracted, and she or he may not be absolutely right for the part, but it's what you've got to work with. Here, we did a big casting session, and we found fabulous kids. I mustn't call them kids, they're all in their late 20s, early 30s, but experienced young opera singers who are much more truthful to the characters as I originally envisaged them. I've had completely to rework the libretto because the translation of the French one wasn't mine, so I had to change all that. But the lyrics, i.e. the words sung to music, are more or less the same. We made one or two changes because of casting, and also there's a very funny second tenor lead, Orestes, who's the playboy son of the king, who in the original French was a trouser role because that was piquant and got the tired businessmen in the front row hot under their collars, but just looks silly now. So we've got a proper boy to sing him, and he's one of those posh white boys who thinks he's black, and it is hilarious. It is hilarious. So he's giving it all the moves, and that's absolutely turned the Orestes scenes into scene stealers. They're fantastic.
And you say you only have a cast of 6?
No. But sorry, an orchestra of 6.
Oh, an orchestra of 6.
And a cast of 12. So no chorus, but that doesn't matter because you're very up close in this production, and when you're closer, 12 opera singers going full at you, it sounds like Aida in the Amphitheatro di Verona. It's very loud.
It's easy for you to say. And presumably also because these people don't have the diva personality, shall we say. They propose to turn up for every
They turn up for
yes.
rehearsals, yes, and they don't chuck because they've got a sore toenail, which is nice.
Yes.
Which is nice, yes.
And how do you generate the tone as a director then?
I think, it's very, very much more easy when you've originated the words they're saying yourself, because they obviously stem from my own character. I find I have a lot of the Greek in me. And because it is written in the French, in jokey rhyming couplets or gaggy rhymes that happen every sort of 4 lines, which is kind of my currency as Kit and the Widow. And so I think the tone it is kind of sui generis, to use a Latin phrase. I'm sorry, I don't know what the Greek for that is.
I'll ask Mr. Gilbert. The name, however, I have to put this on your plate. I did mention it to a friend of mine who said, "Oh, sounds like a porn film."
The Troy Boys.
I don't know if you have any comment.
No, he hasn't entirely missed the mark, because what we're doing is entering a woman's sensually erotic fantasy. And so if it is a porn film, it's one of those porn films that made by women for women, where
soft focus
and a boy with broad shoulders and too long hair. He is meant to be her junior. So a porn film is going too strong, but I think that there is in that French sensuality something of that, and I do hope that Our Lady from Chislehurst isn't averse to the odd Jackie Collins novel.
Oh, I'm sure underneath she'll be loving it. But it's coming together nicely.
Touch wood. I haven't been exposed yet. I've managed to bluff my way through. Yeah, I'm a great one for. I'm slightly sort of head as a flock of pigeons at the moment, because what I like to do, even in writing a song, is get the whole thing down as quickly as possible and then start working on the detail. So this first week of staging, we've just been whizzing through it and just making the spaces, making the pictures, giving people space in which to express their characters. And I think if you're doing that and you can run it again and again and again for the last week, then a lot of the detail finds itself. And these are intelligent, inventive, vibrant young actors. They will find stuff, and they already are, details in their characters which possibly hadn't occurred to me at all. I do think it's an absolutely collaborative process, and the actors bring as much to it as I possibly could. I'm trying to make them sing more like a French café concert, as I say. So there's more diction, there's more rubato, there's more stopping and starting. But a lot of these, even Helene's big arias, are verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus, such as you might hear at Wilton's Music Hall in the 1890s, with a da-dam joke at the end of it. It's trying to make them unlearn a little bit of what they learned at opera school. But mercifully, they're so young in their careers that they haven't got into the pure and wonderful Joan Sutherland line where you can't hear a bloody word she's saying.
No, quite. You have to take it as a whole, with a bit of a run-up, I always think.
Or have read your libretto first. But here we're in a tiny space, virtually all the time, and they're bang in your face, and with a half-decent wind behind us, they'll be able to hear all the words.
Good diction, in fact.
Good diction is the word we're looking for.
Which is back to Gilbert, funnily enough.
Back to Gilbert, and back to my training as a chorister, and then subsequently as a cabaret singer, where the words are supremely important.
Can I ask, has it given you an insight into Offenbach, which you may not have had before, either good or bad? Is he as good as his reputation says he is?
I think he's very occasionally repetitive. In his plot choices. For example, La Belle Helene is exactly what Orpheus in the Underworld is, with taking the mickey out of the gods, and the same set of gods, actually, to a large extent. And occasionally, but blissfully for me, you get that fifth, sixth thing that you get in the barcarolle. But I'm rather fond of the old boy. I like him because he was clearly a theatrical practitioner. He was a practical man of the stage. He wasn't like Wagner writing up his ivory tower stuff that's almost unperformable, but stuff that absolutely connected with the audience. And we're finding that connection again and again and again, just sort of happening in rehearsals. And I rather like his soft centre, the old darling. You know, it's lovely to be able to write that act too, and mean it. And say that, you know, life is a comedy to those who think and he thought. It was never a tragedy to him, I don't think. But he did have a sentimental side. And that sentimental music of his is ravishing and very approachable. And very direct. And it's like the lyrics, it hits you on first hearing. You don't have to go away and study it in music school and cope with hideous dissonances and complicated leitmotifs. It's just there as very serviceable, occasionally very inspired music to serve a practical purpose, which is to entertain an audience for 2 hours.
It's funny you should say that, because you've just described, in a way, his photograph as well. Because
I don't know if I looked much at his
There's a famous picture of him where he's bespectacled, but sort of twinkly.
There is a twinkly,
yes.
Yeah. I suspect he had a wonderful time with some of his chorus girls and quaffing champagne from their knickers later, after the show. There is that sort of generosity, oh, stop being so bloody moralistic, life's short, let's fall in love and have fun, about him and about this piece.
He's not straight-laced at all.
Not at all, absolutely not at all. Indeed, you know, his ending and my ending are identical. Our Shirley Valentine does go off with her Troy Boy and she doesn't go back to Liverpool.
The melodies as well for Offenbach are what people talk about, and I was just listening. I find his tunes tend to lodge in my mind.
They do, and we're all humming them on the tube on the way home. It's not that Offenbach's Belle has got any mighty lollipops. I mean, Orpheus has got the can, and Tales of Hoffmann has got the barcarolle, which are way up there, you know, classic FM top 1 and 2. But these, and there are a couple of fabulous marches for the for the pompous Zeusian Greek heroes, and some of Helene's intimate, thoughtful, ravishing arias, which do absolutely hit you first time, and then third time and fourth time because they come round again.
There's a reprise or two.
He does. He likes his reprises. Well, you know, Claude Michel Schoenberg does the same. You know, if you've got a good tune, let them hear it. Richard Rodgers did the same thing. You know, it's always done in the best possible taste. I mean, it doesn't actually.
I'll have my beer now, thank you.
He doesn't turn it into music hall.
No.
And there is always a commanding and formidable musical composer's intelligence behind it all. But no, he knew the power of a good tune.
I like the King's Couplets, I think it's called. Is it?
Yes, it's great, and all the four high kings of Hellas come downstage and deliver a number, and it's pure Maurice Chevalier. It's great, and it's a very, very catchy little tune.
Yes, that's the one that caught me this afternoon, I must tell you.
And it's in fact how the overture opens. That's what he fires off as his first salvo.
So by the end, everyone's saying, "Oh, I like this one."
We like that tune. Yeah, it's a great tune. But again, I mean, I think that was Sullivan's gift. That while never tipping over into Tin Pan Alley, he could spin a great melody and wasn't afraid of doing so. Wasn't afraid of being accused of being second-rate for doing so.
No. I mean, do you have an insight into the difference between Offenbach and Sullivan, or because I know Sullivan is so often called the British or the English Offenbach, which is a little unfair on the two of them, I always think.
I think they are distinct. I think Sullivan is very well. I mean, he's more English. His antecedents. You can hear Thomas Arne in there. You can hear English pastoral music. You can hear the Beggar's Opera in there. Offenbach's colourings are more subtle. There's more stop and start. He's much freer with his playing with his tempi and changing his tempi, and he's more sparing in his recit than Sullivan could be sometimes. But I think they are both underrated, to tell the truth. I'm a huge fan of Sullivan. So is Dilly Keane, I'm discovering. We're about to go into Cowdy Custard together. And
at the Greenwich Theatre, I think, is that right?
Are we doing it? I think we are doing it at Greenwich, apart from a few others. We're doing the sort of Waitrose circuit. Anywhere with a Waitrose, we will be playing.
I'll rebuild the Chiswick Hall then. They knocked it down after Shirley Bassey came in 1966. You know, the Chiswick musical.
Didn't need to
Chiswick
after
Empire.
a few of those big notes. I would have thought the whole thing would have crumbled.
So, are you happy to talk a little bit about that?
About Cowdy Custard?
Yes.
Absolutely, yes, why not? I mean, it's terribly... We've only just done one sing-through and we haven't even cast the boy yet, so it's a tiny bit previous, but I'll say what I know.
Well, forgive me, I was going to say, because you have worked with Dilly Keane before. This is
Adore
you and
her.
the Widow.
Me and the Widow, and Dilly Keane, and Liza Pullman, who's another
One of the
member of
fascinating
the
Aiderettes.
fascinating Aiderettes. Sadly, Adele Anderson is not available. She's got to go to New Zealand, and I'm heartbroken because I would love to have heard her sing 20th Century Blues. And then an as yet unnamed boy who's got to be gorgeous, because Widow and I are getting very long in the tooth now.
Oh, it's all a matter of taste. You know.
And it's the Cowdy Custard, which was the huge hit of the 1970s, which Coward himself saw just before he died.
72, I think.
72.
He came to the Mermaid Theatre.
And it's very Mermaid Theatre. It has occasionally, it's a bit too Mermaid Theatre, like there's an Act 2 opener which is very Landania, with a lot of rather sub-prime Coward Landan numbers. It has
That's all his stuff from The Girl Who Came to Suffer.
That sort of
isn't it, I
stuff,
think,
yes.
Or,
And it all
which
goes...
was his last musical show from the early 60s? Or?
It goes a bit Lionel Bart,
Yes.
and not that Lionel wasn't fabulous as well, but it's so... And also because of various copyright issues in 1972, there were some songs they weren't allowed to include, which were Coward Crown Jewels, because they were in other shows which were in production at the time. So we're able to, I think, touch wood, the estate has given us permission to maybe jettison most of the Landania, apart from London Pride, which no one would want to jettison. And we can...
There's poor old Mrs. Brisket going then.
What ho, Mrs. Brisket? Yes, oh God, you don't
Why
like
not
that
take
one,
a
do you?
chance and risk it?
Oh God!
Straight back 150 years, isn't it?
I remember Victor Spinetti saying the only thing you can do with those numbers is put an extra syllable on the end of each line. So, what ho, Mrs. Brisket? Take a right out of Brisket, to send it to the back of the cheap seats of the gods. But
But it was Tessie O'Shea, wasn't it?
it was bless Tessie O'Shea, razor
Bless
glaster
O'Shea.
Tessie O'Shea. God, she's missed. She was fabulous, wasn't she?
Was. And only passed the last 10 years or so, I think.
Yeah, was she?
Yeah.
She was a good-looking old fat lady. I love good-looking fat ladies.
So you do love a fairy when she's 40?
I do love a fairy when she's 40, and a long way past 40, which I think Tess was by the time Tessie, when I was first exposed to her art. But no, it's Cowdy Custard, and as I say, we'll have another boy, and it's Widow and Dilly and occasionally Liza doing the honours and the ivories. I'm in no position to do the honours and any ivories. We're also going to, because times have changed and we know more about Coward, and Coward had to, as a pre-1964 gay guy, had to bury all that. Going to make some of that a tiny bit more explicit. For example, he wrote what I think is the most beautiful of his songs, and which I think was his favourite song, Matelote, to his longtime companion Graham Payne. And so we're going to put Matelote in and have a boy singing it to a boy. Why not?
Would you be going for the extra verse or Mad About the Boy?
Oh yes, the dirty extra, which is terribly funny, and I won't reveal to your listeners because otherwise they won't come and see. But the rhyme is Myrna
if you're listening
Loy.
to me, they will.
The rhyme is Myrna Loy. I fought for that one. Yeah, please, can I do that? And it'll be lovely to hear Mad About the Boy sung as Coward wrote it, rather than in the Ether Kit version where all the timing goes askew.
Oh, cool. Well, there's so many verses to it, aren't there? Because isn't it supposed to be 4 or 5 people?
4 or 5 people. I think it was done as a review number, and presumably everyone trooped on the stage with their own special spot on them and in their different characters.
Wasn't Joyce Grenfell, I think?
Was she really? She would have been terribly funny.
I think she might have been the schoolgirl.
Who thinks he's prettier than Gary Cooper?
Yes.
Yeah. No, that would be very funny with all those teeth.
Just for our listeners, that's Joyce Grenfell's teeth rather than Gary Cooper's.
Oh no, rather than Gary Cooper's teeth. Did he not write it about Gary Cooper? Isn't that? I think.
Was it Gary Cooper? I always assumed it was Rudolph Valentino. I took
it was meant to be Rudolph Valentino, but I think it was inspired, secretly by Gary Cooper. I think. There you go.
I live and learn.
Well, I may have got that completely wrong, and the listeners will write in.
I heard Peter Greenwell, I think his name was,
who was Peter Greenwell, who was his accompanist.
The last accompanist.
Fantastic.
Yes,
fantastic guy.
He only passed away a couple of
years ago. Yes.
And, forgive me, I'm rambling and going off on a tangent here, but I think he wrote the music for the Peter Wilderblood musical, which was called The Crooked Mile, which introduced Millicent Martin.
Gosh.
The most lovely song called If I Ever Fall in Love Again. It will be with someone just like you. It's such,
wow.
It's such a beautiful song.
What a lovely idea
and
for a lyric.
And no one ever sings it anymore. It's such a pity.
What a shame. I took Pete Greenwell around some caves in Barbados, I remember once.
Oh, really?
But that's another story.
Oh, you're such a tempter, a tease. Are there any songs in it which are a little bit off the beaten track? Because I hadn't realised quite how many. Well, he was such a prodigious writer. How many of his songs were not recorded either by him or by anyone, as far as
exactly. And I mean things like the wonderful "We're a Dear Old Couple and We Hate Each Other."
Yes.
Hated one another for a long time, which was right at the end of his career.
Sail Away,
yes. Which is just beautiful. Yes, I think they were quite interested when they compiled it, Alan Strachan and his team, in the 70s.
And the late Wendy Toy.
And the late great Dame.
Sorry. Yes.
Not to maybe to mine the unknown seams, because Coward was incredibly current in the 70s, and everybody knew everything. And so I think they did kind of go a bit off-piste and try and find the...
It's Miss Mouse, I think, on the original listing. I don't know if that's made it into your version.
Oh,
I don't know the song at all. I saw it there and I thought, goodness.
Miss Mouse. No, lost on me. Gone back into the skirting board. Don't know.
Scurried away. So you're still performing, obviously, as well. You're much in demand as you're directing now, and you're about to perform and pulling everything together. If I may say.
Yes.
And do you ever get to see your family? I have to ask.
Hardly at all. No, there was a slightly terse conversation last night about that. But no, mercifully, my children have grown up and fled, so I'm less guilty about that. Kate, I think, is coming down to join me here in London, because we live in Norfolk, but. She's coming down to join me next week to offer solace. And it is terribly busy, and I'm in my white van with a bed in the back, my touring van, rather more than I would wish, especially in this cold weather. But it's better than not working, isn't it?
Oh, it absolutely is. Yes, and this, I suppose, do you think direction is being revived in you? Is this something you'd like to do further?
Well, shall we see what happens?
There's many shows under your belt, aren't there?
See what happens on the first night. I must say, I'm thrilled to have discovered this company, and there are little projects and little irons in the fire, which were dangling like pieces of raw meat in front of the Arts Council, but of course the Arts Council hasn't got a bean left, so...
Meat and beans, however, is a fairly tasty dinner. So.
Oh, it sounds nice, doesn't it? Yeah, a bit of meat and beans. So, well, we shall see. I mean,
is there a show you're hankering to do? Either one that you've written yourself, or it's a show that you're...
yes.
Am I at liberty to ask? Or rather keep that powder dry?
I'll keep my powder dry on that one, yes. It's one that has been done before, and... I has done it many times, actually, in about 4 different productions, and I've done an enormous rework on it, and I would very much like to restage it in a sort of Spiegel tent circus space, which it's never been done before with a gypsy orchestra rather than with a West End orchestra. And we'll see. But who knows? I hope I don't crash and burn on the 4th of February. And if I come out of it without too much... dripping off me. I'll
acclaim.
Acclaim. That's
absolutely.
The thing. Yes. Then I'll. I would love to do more. Yeah, it's fun, and it's also lovely to, like with The Merry Widow, do all the work and then go back to bed and sit in bed and just think that other people are enjoying it, and you don't physically have to haul your increasingly flaccid old ass around the country to give it to them.
May I ask just one final question?
Of course.
And it's actually more of a sort of philosophical question.
Ooh.
And it's often been argued, not least by me, but other people rather more important and intelligent, that Andrew Lloyd Webber is in fact writing modern operetta.
I think that's very true. Very true.
Can you see a line through him all the way through?
Oh, absolutely.
Ivor Novello, Gilbert and Sullivan, Noel Coward, Bittersweet,
Absolutely.
and to Offenbach?
I absolutely can. I mean, his music, he was the son of a very distinguished church organist, and those...
This is Andrew Lloyd Webber.
William Lloyd Webber, his father.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. And presumably learnt an awful lot at his father's knee in that sort of Anglican melodic tradition that that Sullivan, that wasn't afraid of a good tune and repeating a good tune. And I do think that certainly his subjects are more operatic.
Mm.
I mean, his settings, a Coney Island funfair or a deserted mansion, they're not the immediately identifiable reality of Sondheim settings a lot of the time. I think that's absolutely true, and just the scale and the breadth of his music and the breadth of the intervals he uses. So no, I think that's absolutely arguable. Yeah.
I actually saw Phantom of the Opera relatively recently for the first time.
Oh right.
Well,
the clue is in the title, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, I thought to myself, I suppose it is, absolutely. I hadn't even thought about the obvious, the Scooby-Doo nature of it. But I watched it and I thought, actually, there's a jolly good Gilbert and Sullivan operetta in here. Because some of those characters, if you gave just the tone, if you changed the tone...
Change the tone, like Stevie said.
Yes,
yeah.
You could rework that into a...
Exactly, and you'd be into The Good Companions or something. It'd be great.
What, the recent version with... the recent version, the Andre Previn...
Yes,
Harwood,
yes, yeah. The musical version of it. No, absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely the case. So I keep on saying absolutely. That's a bit sort of hopeless.
So so just to get this absolutely right, it opens at the theatre, which is above the Gatehouse.
Yeah, the Gatehouse in Highgate. We have a couple of sort of preview-y outings. One, as I say, in the Wetherspoons Tunbridge Wells. It's called the Opera House Tunbridge Wells, but it is now a Wetherspoons. And then we hit the London run, where we are for some time, 3 or 4 weeks, upstairs at the Gatehouse, where is your chance to drink ouzo with naked boys and girls. I mean, what could be better?
Well, I should think I'll book myself several tickets, if I may. Kit, as always, a real joy. Thank you so much for your insights, because I have to say, genuinely, you open up otherwise closed text and approaches to text. So I'm very grateful to you.
Oh, thank you. Not at all. And it's, as I say, this is just a load of fun for me and hopefully for the audience.
Musical talk. And there we are, the wonderful Kit Hesketh-Harvey in conversation with me from a few years ago about his wonderful version of La Belle Helene, which he had retranslated into English in a very witty way, and which was then being performed. I saw it on a number of occasions around London and enjoyed it every time. And I should say I also saw it being performed in The Scoop, which is a dedicated theatrical space, usually for free performances, outside what was until recently City Hall, the Greater London Authority building. And on that particular night, as we reached the end of Act 1, the skies opened. The performers were utterly drenched, and what few members of the audience decided to hang around, such as myself, were all huddled under umbrellas. But if you want a good example of professionalism, that was it. Those performers, dressed in nothing more than togas, were soaked to the skin and performing in torrential rain and an electrical thunderstorm, whilst the equally brave technical staff had to leap out from behind their marquees and dismantle the electrical lighting because it was dangerous in an electrical thunderstorm in the pouring rain. Unfortunately, the weather defeated the production, and so we never got to see Act 2 on that occasion. But luckily I had seen it more than once. But it stands out as one of the most amazing evenings of theatre I've ever seen, and for its professionalism by the cast and the crew, performing against the odds in the most terrible conditions. And before that interview with Kit Hesketh-Harvey, you heard the always wonderful, always interesting Michael Gordon-Shapiro talking about Horseplay, the Troy musical by Ross MacFarlane, which you could have seen at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2015, and subsequently, up to and including now, on YouTube. It's worth having a look. And it seems to me that if I want you to watch it, I need to make time in your very busy schedule. So I'm going to do that by ending this episode, which means you should probably have nothing else in your life left to do but watch Horseplay the musical on YouTube. So go off and do that once I've said the next word. Goodbye. And that was the word, by the way. This episode of Musical Talk, presented by Thos Ribbits and Michael Gordon Shapiro, and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2022. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos.